Chapter 1. The Weight of Two Seas. An Empire at its Zenith. Welcome to Nidra Narratives. Settle in, like and subscribe this channel, and leave in comments what content would you like to see. Tonight we travel to a time when a single empire stretched from the snow-capped passes of the Hindu Kush to the sun-baked plateaus of central India, when Greek ambassadors debated philosophy with Indian priests in gilded halls, and when a young emperor inherited the mightiest realm the subcontinent had ever known, only to be nearly forgotten by history, overshadowed by the towering figures of his father and his son. How does one rule an empire so vast that messengers take weeks to carry a single command from the capital to its farthest provinces? What becomes of a king who conquers 16 kingdoms, yet leaves behind no monuments bearing his name? And why did the citizens of one of the empire's most important cities revolt twice during his reign, only to welcome his disfavored son as a liberator? Let us travel back together to the waning years of the 4th century before the Common Era, to the great city of Pataliputra, where the monsoon winds sweep across the Gangetic plains, and the air carries the mingled scents of sandalwood incense and flowering jasmine. The first thing a traveller would notice, approaching from the dusty roads of the Uttarapatha, that great northern highway linking the imperial heartland to the mountain passes of the northwest, was the change in the air itself. Long before the city walls came into view, the fragrance of wood smoke and cooking fires mingled with something sweeter, the perfume of flowering trees carried on the breeze from the royal gardens. Then, rising from the flat alluvial plain where the Son River merged with the mighty Ganga, the massive timber palisades of the imperial capital would emerge from the morning haze, their wooden towers catching the first golden light of dawn. This was Pataliputra, and by any measure of the ancient world, it was extraordinary. According to the Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who had resided at the court of the previous emperor, the city stretched approximately 9 miles in length and 1.5 miles in width, a parallelogram of human habitation nestled at the confluence of 2 great rivers. The city was protected by massive timber palisades, pierced by 64 gates, and crowned by some 570 towers, the whole defensive perimeter further secured by a broad moat that served both as a barrier against invaders and as a drainage system for the teeming metropolis within. The choice of wood as the primary building material was not merely practical, but deeply considered. The alluvial soils of the Gangetic plain were prone to flooding, and brick structures, while more permanent in appearance, were vulnerable to the periodic inundations that swept through the region during the monsoon months. Wood, by contrast, could be more easily repaired and replaced, and the great forests of northern India provided an abundance of timber, sal and teak, deodar and sandalwood, that skilled craftsmen transformed into the soaring columns and intricately carved beams that adorned both public buildings and private residences. It was into this world of imperial grandeur that a young prince named Bindusara ascended to the throne around 297 BCE at the age of 22. He inherited a realm that stretched from the snow-capped passes of the Hindu Kush in the northwest to the fertile deltas of Bengal in the east, from the towering ramparts of the Himalayas to the sun-baked plateaus of central India. His father, Chandragupta Maurya, had accomplished something unprecedented in Indian history: the creation of a unified empire encompassing most of the subcontinent, achieved through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic skill, and administrative innovation that had overthrown the Nanda dynasty, defeated the Seleucid forces in the northwest, and established a centralized bureaucratic state that commanded resources on a scale never before seen in India. The circumstances of Bindusara's birth are shrouded in the mists of legend. According to the 12th century Jain writer Hemachandra, his mother was Dodara, a queen of Chandragupta, whose life was tragically cut short by the very measures designed to protect the royal family. The legend speaks of Chanakya, that master strategist and architect of Mauryan power, known also as Kautilya, the author of the Arthashastra, that remarkable treatise on statecraft, who had been administering small doses of poison to the emperor's food to build immunity against assassination attempts. One fateful day, the pregnant Durdara unknowingly consumed the poisoned meal, and Chanakya, arriving too late to save the queen, performed an emergency procedure to rescue the unborn child. The infant emerged with a drop of poison upon his forehead, a bindu, and thus received his name, Bindusara. Whether this dramatic tale contains historical truth or represents the embroidery of later storytellers seeking to explain the emperor's unusual name, we cannot say with certainty. What we can affirm is that Bindusara was the legitimate son of Chandragupta, attested by multiple independent sources, including the various Puranas, the ancient Hindu texts of mythology and history, and the Sri Lankan chronicle Mahavamsa. The Greeks, who maintained diplomatic relations with the Mauryan court throughout this period, knew Bindusara by a different name, Amitrakartes, a Hellenized rendering of the Sanskrit title Amitragata, meaning slayer of enemies or destroyer of foes. This martial epithet suggests that Bindusara's contemporaries viewed him as a formidable military leader, a reputation that would be earned through his campaigns in the Deccan and his successful management of the empire's turbulent northwestern frontier. The young emperor inherited not merely territory, but an entire system of governance that his father and the brilliant Chanakya had constructed over 3 decades of relentless effort. The Mauryan administrative apparatus represented perhaps the most sophisticated bureaucratic structure the ancient world had yet produced. At its apex sat the emperor, the supreme executive, legislative, and judicial authority, supported by a council of ministers called the Mantri Parishad. Below this central authority extended a hierarchy of officials, the Ajakshas or superintendents, who oversaw some 24 departments, managing everything from agriculture to armaments. The Mahamatras, or High Commissioners, who implemented imperial policy, and the vast network of provincial governors, district magistrates, and village headmen who translated the emperor's will into daily reality. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a Kumara, a royal prince, ensuring that the most strategically important regions remained under direct family control. The 4 great provincial capitals, Taxila in the northwest, commanding the routes leading from India through the mountain passes into Central Asia, Ujjain in the west, controlling trade routes between northern and western India, Tasali in the east, and Suvarnagiri in the south, served as nodes of imperial authority, connected to the capital at Pataliputra by an extensive network of roads that facilitated both commerce and the rapid movement of troops. The transition of power from Chandragupta to Bindusara appears to have been remarkably smooth, a testament to the institutional strength of the Mauryan state. According to Jain tradition, Chandragupta abdicated the throne voluntarily, embracing the ascetic life and eventually travelling south to Shravanabelagola in Karnataka, where he is said to have ended his days practicing the Jain ritual of Salakana, fasting unto death. Whether this account is historically accurate or represents a later Jain appropriation of the great emperor's legacy, the peaceful succession suggests that Bindusara's claim to the throne was uncontested and that the administrative machinery continued to function without disruption. As Bindusara settled into his role as emperor, the great city of Pataliputra continued to flourish as one of the largest and most prosperous urban centres in the ancient world. The royal palace itself stood at the heart of this wooden city, and here the Greek observers found themselves genuinely astonished. The ancient writer Elian, drawing upon earlier accounts, wrote that the royal residences of India surpassed in splendour even the legendary palaces of Susa and Ecbatana in Persia. a remarkable claim given the fame of those Achaemenid capitals throughout the Mediterranean world. The Mauryan palace complex, as described by Megasthenes, stood within a walled park filled with ornamental trees, where tame peacocks, the bird that would become synonymous with the dynasty itself, strutted among flowering shrubs, and pheasants called from the branches of mango and Ashoka trees. Lakes stocked with sacred fish reflected the sky, their surfaces occasionally broken by the splash of a feeding crane or the glide of a painted stork. Within the palace grounds, the architecture combined indigenous Indian traditions with influences that had filtered eastward from the Persian world following Alexander's conquests. The great pillared halls, with their polished stone columns rising toward painted ceilings, bore a resemblance to the hypostyle halls of Persepolis. Yet they were unmistakably Indian in their proportions and ornamentation. Archaeological excavations at Qumrahar, the site of ancient Pataliputra, have revealed the remains of just such a hall, an assembly chamber supported by 80 pillars arranged in regular rows, their polished surfaces still gleaming after 2 millennia beneath the soil. The single surviving pillar, carved from a single block of sandstone and finished to a mirror-like sheen, using techniques that modern craftsmen struggle to replicate, testifies to the extraordinary skill of Mauryan stoneworkers. This famous Mauryan polish, a technique that seems to have been developed during Chandragupta's reign and perfected under Bindusara, represents one of the great mysteries of ancient craftsmanship. The surfaces were worked to such a degree of smoothness that they reflected light like glass, a finish achieved without the benefit of modern abrasives or power tools. Some scholars have suggested that the technique was borrowed from Achaemenid Persia, where similar polishing methods were employed on royal statuary, the knowledge perhaps carried eastward by displaced craftsmen following Alexander's destruction of the Persian Empire. Whatever its origins, the technique seems to have been lost after the Mauryan period, for no subsequent Indian dynasty achieved comparable results. This was the world that Bindusara knew intimately, the setting in which he would conduct the affairs of empire for a quarter century. It was a world of remarkable sophistication and complexity, where Greek ambassadors debated philosophy with Brahmin priests, the priestly scholarly class who served as guardians of Hindu scripture and ritual, where Ajivika ascetics prophesied the fates of princes, where merchants from 100 nations brought goods from the ends of the earth. And it was a world built, quite literally, of wood and stone and human ingenuity, a monument to what organized human effort could achieve in an age before steel and concrete, before electricity and internal combustion, when the primary sources of power were muscle and water and the patient labor of countless hands. Chapter 2. A World of Empires, Hellenistic Kings and Eastern Philosophers. To understand Bindusara's reign in its proper context, we must first transport ourselves to the wider world of the late 4th and early 3rd centuries before the Common Era, a world still reeling from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE and the subsequent fragmentation of his vast empire into competing kingdoms ruled by his former generals and their descendants. While Bindusara consolidated Mauryan power in India from 298 to 273 BCE, the Mediterranean world was convulsed by what historians call the Wars of the Diadochi, the Successor Wars, a series of brutal conflicts that would determine the political geography of the Hellenistic world for centuries to come. The term Hellenistic itself requires explanation. It derives from the Greek word Hellas, meaning Greece, but refers not to Greece proper, but to the Greek-like civilization that spread across the eastern Mediterranean, western Asia, and northeastern Africa following Alexander's conquests. This was a world where Greek language, culture, and administrative practices blended with local traditions to create vibrant hybrid societies. Much as Mauryan India represented a synthesis of indigenous traditions with influences from the Persian and Greek worlds that had preceded it. By the time Bindusara ascended the Mauryan throne, around 298 BCE, the dust was beginning to settle on the most violent phase of the successor wars. The decisive Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE had established a rough balance of power among three major kingdoms. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, ruled by the descendants of Ptolemy I Soter. The Seleucid Empire, stretching from Syria through Mesopotamia and Persia to the borders of India, governed by the heirs of Seleucus I Nicator, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia and Greece. These three powers would dominate the Hellenistic world throughout Bindusara's reign, their rivalries and alliances shaping the international order of the age. The Seleucid Empire, ruled during most of Bindusara's reign by Antiochus I Soter, who succeeded his father Seleucus in 281 BCE, was India's most immediate connection to the Hellenistic world. Antiochus inherited not only a vast and unwieldy empire, but also the diplomatic relationship his father had established with Chandragupta Maurya through the Treaty of 303 BCE. This agreement had ceded territories east of the Indus River to the Mauryas in exchange for 500 war elephants and established peaceful relations between the two empires. The exchange of ambassadors, Megasthenes to Chandragupta's court and later Dimachus to Bindusara's, represented one of the most remarkable instances of diplomatic engagement between East and West in the ancient world. Antiochus I's reign, which overlapped almost entirely with Bindusara's, was marked by challenges remarkably similar to those facing the Mauryan emperor. Both rulers had inherited vast empires from powerful fathers and faced the task of consolidating territories that encompassed diverse peoples, languages, and traditions. Both confronted external threats. Antiochus from Celtic invaders called Galatians, who poured into Asia Minor around 278 BCE. Bindusara from the unconquered kingdoms of the Deccan Plateau. And both sought to maintain their authority through a combination of military strength, administrative efficiency, and cultural patronage. The Galatian invasion that Antiochus faced provides an instructive parallel to Bindusara's Deccan campaigns. These Celtic warriors, migrating from Central Europe, had swept through the Balkans and crossed into Asia Minor, where their raids terrorized the Greek cities of the region. Antiochus's victory over them around 275 BCE, achieved through the use of war elephants, those same beasts his father had acquired from Chandragupta, earned him the title Soter, meaning savior. The parallel is striking. Just as Bindusara was extending Mauryan control over the Deccan and earning the epithet Amitragata, Antiochus was defending his realm against barbarian invaders and receiving comparable honors from the cities he protected. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled Egypt from 284 to 246 BCE, presided over what many historians consider the golden age of Ptolemaic civilization. His reign, which encompassed the entirety of Bindusara's, saw Alexandria transformed into the greatest center of learning in the Mediterranean world. The Library of Alexandria, completed under Ptolemy II's patronage, assembled the largest collection of texts in antiquity, perhaps as many as 500,000 scrolls, while the museum attracted scholars, poets, and scientists from across the known world. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was completed during his reign, its beacon visible for miles across the Mediterranean. The wealth that funded these cultural achievements derived from Egypt's extraordinarily productive agricultural system and its control of key trade routes. Ancient sources claim that Ptolemy II's annual revenue reached 14,800 talents of silver and 1.5 million artabas of wheat, figures that, even if exaggerated, suggests staggering wealth. The parallel with the Mauryan Empire's wealth, derived from the fertile Gangetic plains and extensive trade networks, is evident. Both empires represented the economic powerhouses of their respective regions. In the great audience hall of the Mauryan palace at Pataliputra, where gilded pillars rose towards ceilings painted with scenes of divine splendor, and the air was heavy with the fragrance of sandalwood and jasmine, a remarkable gathering of minds and cultures took place during Bindusara's reign. Here, Greek ambassadors in their flowing robes conversed with Brahmin priests in their sacred threads, while Ajivika ascetics, with their distinctive practices, mingled with Buddhist monks and Jain teachers. The court of Bindusara was, by all accounts, one of the most cosmopolitan centers of learning and diplomacy in the ancient world. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing several centuries later, but drawing upon earlier sources, records that Dimachus of Plataea became the Seleucid ambassador to the Mauryan court during Bindusara's reign. Like his predecessor Megasthenes, Dimachus apparently wrote extensively on India, and fragments of his observations are quoted by later authors, though his original works are now lost. A recent scholarly reassessment suggests that Dimachus likely had access to court informants and temple records during his extended stay at Bindusara's court, his accounts reportedly including descriptions of administrative practices, city planning in Pataliputra, and religious customs of Brahmins and Buddhists. The 3rd century Greek writer Athenaeus preserves a delightful anecdote that reveals much about the cultural curiosity of the Mauryan court. Bindusara, we are told, requested Antiochus to send him sweet wine, dried figs, and a sophist, a Greek philosopher. Antiochus replied that he would gladly send the wine and the figs, but that Greek laws forbade him to sell a sophist. This exchange, whether historically accurate or apocryphal, reveals Bindusara's genuine interest in Greek intellectual traditions. The Mauryan court was already home to multiple philosophical schools, Brahmanical teachers expounding the Vedas and Upanishads, Buddhist monks preaching the Dharma, Jain ascetics practicing their rigorous disciplines, and the addition of a Greek sophist would have enriched this already diverse intellectual environment. Beyond the Seleucid connection, Bindusara's court also received diplomatic attention from Ptolemaic Egypt. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder records that Ptolemy II Philadelphus sent an envoy named Dionysius to India, most likely to Bindusara's court at Pataliputra. The presence of Egyptian diplomats at Pataliputra further underscores the international significance of the Mauryan court and its role as a hub of transcontinental diplomacy. Within this international milieu, the Ajivika teachers held a special place in Bindusara's personal religious life. The Ajivikas were an ancient Indian philosophical school founded by Makali Gosala, a contemporary of both the Buddha and Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. According to tradition, Gosala had come to believe that all events in the universe were absolutely predetermined by a cosmic force called niyati, or fate, that the soul's journey through countless rebirths followed a fixed course that no human action could alter, and that therefore the concepts of karma and moral responsibility that were central to both Buddhism and Jainism were fundamentally illusory. This was a philosophy of radical determinism, and its implications were profound. If everything was predetermined by niyati, if the soul would inevitably pass through a fixed number of rebirths before achieving liberation, regardless of one's actions, then what was the purpose of ethical striving? The Ajivikas answered this question in a way that seemed paradoxical to their critics. They practiced extreme asceticism, not because it would hasten their liberation, but because such practice was itself predetermined, part of the cosmic order that they were fated to fulfill. Their austerities were not means to an end, but expressions of their determined lot in the universe. The practices of the Ajivikas were severe even by the standards of ancient Indian asceticism. They wandered naked through the land, carrying only a staff, begging for their food, and accepting whatever was given without preference or complaint. They practiced forms of self-mortification that shocked even other ascetic traditions. Lying on beds of thorns, squatting for extended periods in painful positions, exposing themselves to the elements without shelter. What drew Bindusara to this austere and fatalistic philosophy? For a ruler who had inherited an empire of unprecedented size and complexity, who faced the constant challenges of maintaining order across diverse peoples and territories, the Ajivika doctrine of Nyati may have offered a certain psychological comfort. If the course of events was predetermined, then the weight of decision-making was lightened. The king's choices were not truly his own, but expressions of a cosmic order that transcended human agency. The Buddhist text, Divyavadana, mentions an Ajivika astrologer or priest named Pingala Vatsa who served at the imperial court and who, according to legend, prophesied the future greatness of the young prince Ashoka. According to the legend, Bindusara once asked Pingala Vatsa to assess the abilities of his various sons to determine which was most suited to succeed him as emperor. The Ajivika observed the princes at play and recognized in Ashoka the qualities of a future Chakravartin, a universal ruler whose authority would extend to the natural boundaries of the world. But Pingala Vatsa faced a dilemma. Ashoka was not Bindusara's favoured son, and to declare openly that this disfavoured prince would become emperor might have dangerous consequences. The Ajivika therefore gave an evasive answer to the emperor, while privately informing Queen Subhadrangi, Ashoka's mother, of her son's destined greatness. The Ajivikas reached the height of their popularity during Bindusara's reign, and their influence extended beyond the court to the broader society. The physical evidence of Ajivika presence in Bindusara's India is slim but significant. The most remarkable surviving monuments of the sect are the Barabar caves in what is now Bihar, rock-cut chambers that represent the oldest surviving examples of Indian cave architecture. These caves, carved from solid granite during the Mauryan period, were dedicated to the Ajivikas by Bindusara's grandson, Ashoka, and his successor, Dasharatha. The interiors display the famous Mauryan polish, surfaces worked to such smoothness that they reflect light like mirrors, and the chambers were designed with specific acoustic properties that would have enhanced the meditative practices of the ascetics who used them. This cosmopolitan atmosphere, where Greek ambassadors debated with Indian philosophers, where Ajivika astrologers prophesied the fates of princes, where the emperor himself sought wisdom from both Eastern and Western traditions, represents one of the most remarkable aspects of Bindusara's reign. The court of Pataliputra was not merely a center of political power, but a crucible of cultural exchange, a place where the great intellectual traditions of the ancient world met and mingled. Chapter 3. The Land Between Two Seas. Conquest of the Deccan. The Great Plateau of the Deccan rises from the coastal plains of peninsular India like a vast natural fortress, its black basalt soils stretching endlessly beneath skies that alternate between the fierce heat of summer and the life-giving torrents of the monsoon. It was to this land, this immense tableland bounded by the western and eastern Ghats, watered by the Godavari and Krishna rivers, rich in minerals and agricultural potential, that Bindusara turned his attention in the years following his accession to the Mauryan throne. The conquest of the Deccan would become the defining military achievement of his reign, extending Mauryan authority to the very doorstep of the Tamil kingdoms in the far south, and earning him the epithet Amitragata, the slayer of enemies. The Deccan Plateau, rising to an average elevation of some 2,000 feet above sea level, presented both challenges and opportunities to those who sought to control it. The black soils, formed from the weathering of ancient volcanic basalt, were remarkably fertile when properly cultivated, retaining moisture through the dry season and producing abundant crops of millet, pulses, and cotton. But these same soils were difficult to work, developing deep cracks during the dry months that could swallow a man's leg, and turning to sticky mud during the rains that clung to everything it touched. Agriculture here required different techniques than in the well-watered Gangetic plains. Different crops, different tools, different rhythms of planting and harvest. The 16th century Tibetan Buddhist chronicler Taranatha, drawing upon earlier Indian sources now lost to us, provides the most dramatic account of Bindusara's southern campaigns. According to Taranatha, Chamakya, who continued to serve as one of Bindusara's great lords during the early years of the reign, orchestrated the destruction of the nobles and kings of 16 towns, making Bindusara master of all the territory between the western and the eastern seas. This phrase, the land between the two seas, recurs in multiple sources and clearly refers to the peninsular region stretching from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal, the Deccan Plateau, and the territories immediately to its north and south. The strategic logic of Bindusara's Deccan campaigns is not difficult to discern. The plateau controlled crucial trade routes connecting the northern heartland to the ports of the western and eastern coasts. The region was rich in iron ore, precious stones, and other minerals essential for both commerce and military production. Control of the Deccan would also provide a buffer zone protecting the empire's southern flank, and would generate substantial revenue through taxation of agriculture and trade. Moreover, the prestige of conquering the land between the two seas would cement Bindusara's reputation as a worthy successor to his father and as a Chakravartin, a universal ruler whose authority extended to the natural boundaries of the subcontinent. The military operations themselves would have been formidable undertakings. The Mauryan army, as described by Greek observers and the Arthashastra, was one of the largest standing military forces of the ancient world. According to scholars, the empire wielded approximately 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, and 9,000 war elephants, organized into specialized units for different types of warfare. The army was managed by a board of 30 officers, divided into 6 committees, each overseeing different military branches: the infantry, the cavalry, the elephants, the chariots, the navy, and transport and provisions. Moving such a force across the Deccan would have required careful logistical planning. The plateau's terrain, while not as mountainous as the Himalayas, presented its own challenges. River crossings during the monsoon, the need to secure water sources during the dry season, and the difficulty of maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles of territory. The evidence from Tamil Sangam literature, ancient Tamil poetry composed in the centuries around the Common Era, but preserving memories of earlier times, suggests that the imperial forces engaged in significant engineering works to facilitate their advance. The Sangam texts refer to the Mauryas as Maurya, a Tamil rendering of the Sanskrit Maurya, and in several poems they are designated as Vamba Maurya, which can be translated as the New Mauryas or the Mauryan Strangers. The Agananuru, one of the 8 anthologies of Sangam poetry, contains multiple references to these Mauryan incursions. Verse 69 describes how the Mauryas cut paths through mountains for their chariots to pass, a vivid image of military engineering that recalls Ashoka's later road-building projects. Verse 251 refers to the Mauryas as strangers, while verse 281 speaks of the Mauryas who came with a desire to conquer the south. The Purananuru, another Sangam anthology, contains a poem that describes Mauryan chariots thundering across the land, their white pennants brilliant in the sunshine. The famous Tamil poet Mamilanar, who lived no later than the 1st century BCE, described how areas south of the Deccan Plateau, the region comprising Tamilakam, the Tamil homeland, were invaded by the Mauryan army using troops from Karnataka. Mamilanar states that the Vadagar, peoples who resided in the Andhra-Karnataka regions immediately to the north of Tamil Nadu, formed the vanguard of the Mauryan forces. This detail is significant, suggesting that Bindusara's campaigns were not merely the imposition of northern power upon the south, but involved the mobilization of regional allies and the integration of local military forces into the imperial army. Some scholars have concluded that the Podial Hill, which adjoins the Tirunelveli and Madurai districts in present-day Tamil Nadu to the west, marked the farthest limit of the Mauryan invasion in the south. This would place Mauryan military operations deep into Tamil territory, though apparently without achieving permanent conquest of the Tamil kingdoms themselves. When Bindusara's armies crossed the Vindhya ranges and descended onto the vast plateau, they entered a world markedly different from the Gangetic heartland they had left behind. The people of the Deccan before the Mauryan conquest lived in villages scattered across the plateau, their settlements clustered near water sources and defensible positions. They cultivated millets, jawar and bajra, ragi and kodo, that could withstand the uncertain rainfall better than rice or wheat. They herded cattle and goats across the scrublands, their animals providing milk, meat, and the dung that served as both fuel and fertilizer. They worked iron, which was abundant in the Deccan's mineral-rich soils, forging tools and weapons that gave them an advantage over peoples still dependent on bronze. And they buried their dead in distinctive megalithic tombs, circles of standing stones, cist graves lined with slabs, and dolmens that still dot the Deccan landscape today. The Mauryan conquest brought this world into contact with the sophisticated civilization of the north. Imperial administrators arrived to establish the systems of taxation and governance that had made the Mauryan state so effective. Roads were cut through the forests and across the plateau, connecting the newly conquered territories to the imperial heartland and facilitating the movement of troops, officials, and trade goods. Provincial capitals were established at strategic points, their markets and temples and administrative buildings introducing urban patterns of life to regions that had known only villages. For the common people of the Deccan, the Mauryan conquest meant new obligations and new opportunities. They now owed taxes to a distant emperor, collected by officials who spoke a different language and followed different customs. They were subject to the laws of the Arthashastra, enforced by magistrates who might know nothing of local traditions and practices. But they also gained access to the vast trading networks of the Mauryan Empire, could sell their cotton and iron and precious stones in markets that stretched from Afghanistan to Bengal, and could acquire goods, fine textiles, metalwork, spices that had previously been beyond their reach. Yet the Mauryan presence in the Deccan was never as dense or as transformative as in the Gangetic heartland. The plateau was too vast, its population too scattered, its terrain too difficult for the kind of intensive administration that characterized the imperial core. Provincial governors ruled from their capitals, but their authority faded with distance, and local chiefs and village headmen retained much of their traditional power. The Mauryan imprint was felt most strongly along the major routes of communication and in the towns that grew up around administrative centers. In the remote villages of the interior, life may have continued much as it had before the conquest. The religious landscape of the Deccan was also changing during this period. Buddhism and Jainism, which had spread rapidly through the Gangetic plains, now began to penetrate the plateau. Monks and nuns travelled the new roads, establishing monasteries at strategic points and preaching their doctrines to populations that had previously followed local cults and Vedic traditions. The rock-cut caves that would later become such a distinctive feature of Deccan architecture were beginning to be carved, though the great cave complexes of Ajanta and Ellora lay centuries in the future. The seeds of a transformed religious culture were being planted, though their full flowering would come only after the Mauryan period had ended. The outcome of these campaigns appears to have been the incorporation of most of the Deccan into the Mauryan Empire, with the notable exceptions of Kalinga on the eastern coast and the Tamil kingdoms of the far south. The Cholas, ruled by King Elamchacheni, the Pandyas and the Cheras maintained their independence, apparently through a combination of military resistance and diplomatic accommodation. Ashoka's later edicts mention these kingdoms as friendly neighbours rather than subjects, suggesting that Bindusara had established a modus vivendi with the Tamil rulers, perhaps extracting acknowledgement of Mauryan suzerainty and tribute payments without attempting direct annexation. Kalinga, the coastal kingdom corresponding roughly to modern Odisha, remained conspicuously outside Mauryan control throughout Bindusara's reign. This wealthy and strategically important region, with its access to maritime trade routes and its substantial military resources, would become the target of Ashoka's most famous and most devastating military campaign. The fact that Bindusara did not conquer Kalinga, despite his success elsewhere in the Deccan, suggests either that the kingdom's defences were particularly formidable, or that other priorities, perhaps the need to consolidate gains elsewhere or to address challenges on the northwestern frontier, prevented a sustained campaign against this holdout. The conquest of the Deccan thus represents Bindusara's most significant contribution to the territorial expansion of the Mauryan Empire. While his father, Chandragupta, had unified northern India and secured the northwestern frontier against the Seleucids, it was Bindusara who extended Mauryan authority over the vast southern plateau, creating an empire that encompassed nearly the entire Indian subcontinent. This achievement, though often overshadowed by the more dramatic events of his son Ashoka's reign, established the geopolitical framework within which Ashoka would later operate, and set the stage for the conquest of Kalinga that would transform both the emperor and the empire he ruled. Chapter 4. Rice and Ritual. Daily life in the Mauryan world. As evening fell over Pataliputra, the city would take on a different character. Oil lamps flickered in windows and doorways, casting pools of warm light into the gathering darkness. The sounds of the day, the clamour of commerce, the rumble of cartwheels, the calls of vendors, gave way to quieter rhythms, the chanting of priests in temple precincts, the strains of music from wealthy households, the soft conversations of families gathered for their evening meal. The great wooden gates of the city would swing closed, guards taking their positions on the towers, while within the palace, the king perhaps retired to his private chambers, attended by servants who had been vetted by the elaborate security apparatus that protected the sovereign's life. To understand the world of Bindusara's India, we must clothe its people, must imagine the fabrics that draped their bodies, the ornaments that adorned their limbs, the colours and textures that marked their station in life, and their participation in the great social drama of the Mauryan Empire. For clothing in ancient India was never merely functional. It was a language of identity, a marker of caste and occupation, a canvas upon which individuals displayed their wealth, their piety, and their place in the cosmic order. The basic garment for men throughout the Mauryan period was the dhoti, a long piece of unstitched cloth wrapped around the lower body in various styles depending on region, occupation, and social status. The common man's dhoti might be of plain cotton, undyed, or perhaps coloured with natural dyes extracted from plants, indigo for blue, turmeric for yellow, madder for red. It would be wrapped simply, tucked at the waist and falling to somewhere between the knee and the ankle, leaving the upper body bare or covered only by a light shawl in cooler weather. The farmer working his fields, the craftsman at his bench, the labourer carrying loads through the streets of Pataliputra, all would have worn some variation of this basic garment, its simplicity suited to the demands of physical labour and the heat of the Indian climate. But for the wealthy and the powerful, clothing became an art form. Nobles and courtiers wore dhotis of the finest cotton muslin, so delicately woven that Greek observers compared the fabric to woven air or morning mist. These garments might be embroidered with gold thread, their borders decorated with intricate patterns that identified the wearer's family or region. Over the dhoti, men of status wore the uttariya, an upper garment that could be draped in various ways, thrown over one shoulder, wrapped diagonally across the torso, or arranged to fall in elegant folds from both shoulders. The manner of draping the uttariya was itself a form of communication, signaling the wearer's mood, his formality, his relationship to those around him. Women's clothing followed similar principles of draped, unstitched garments, though the specific styles differed. The earliest evidence of stitched female clothing in India comes from Mauryan period sculptures, suggesting that some women were beginning to wear fitted garments alongside the traditional draped styles. Women of the court might wear ankle-length skirts paired with blouses or shawls, their garments made of the finest cotton or perhaps silk imported from distant lands. The hair was often braided or decorated with flowers, jasmine and marigold, the fragrant champaka and the delicate lotus, and the overall effect was one of studied elegance. But it was in jewelry that the Mauryan love of adornment found its fullest expression. Both men and women wore ornaments of gold and silver, studded with precious stones, rubies and sapphires, emeralds and pearls, the mysterious blue lapis lazuli brought from the mountains of Afghanistan, and the warm carnelian from the western coasts. Earrings were universal, worn by both sexes in styles ranging from simple rings to elaborate disc-shaped ornaments called carnifal or ear flowers. Necklaces might be short and broad, lying flat against the collarbone, or long and pendant, falling to the chest or even the waist. Armlets and bracelets adorned the upper and lower arms respectively, while anklets of gold and silver were preferred by royalty and the wealthy, their designs ranging from simple circular rings to elaborate pieces decorated with bells that chimed with every step. The preparation of the body for adornment was itself an elaborate ritual. Perfumes and cosmetics were widely used, with herbal oils applied to the skin and hair to maintain their health and beauty. The Artha Shastra mentions the superintendent of perfumery among the officials of the Mauryan state, suggesting that the production and trade of scented oils and unguents was significant enough to warrant government oversight. Sandalwood paste, applied to the forehead and body, served both cosmetic and religious purposes, its cooling properties welcome in the Indian heat, and its fragrance pleasing to both humans and gods. The colours of Mauryan clothing carried symbolic significance that would have been immediately legible to contemporary observers. White was associated with purity and was worn for religious ceremonies and by those in mourning. Saffron and ochre were the colours of renunciation, worn by ascetics who had abandoned worldly life. Red was auspicious, associated with fertility and marriage, while blue, particularly the deep indigo produced from the leaves of the indigofera plant, was common among working people, perhaps because the dye was relatively inexpensive and the colour resistant to fading. The story of Bindusara's request to the Seleucid king Antiochus I, asking for sweet wine, dried figs, and a Greek philosopher, tells us something profound about the culinary curiosity of the Mauryan court. Here was an emperor who ruled over one of the most agriculturally productive regions on earth, whose kitchens could command the finest ingredients from across the subcontinent, yet who still yearned for the exotic flavours of the Mediterranean world. To understand the food of Bindusara's India, we must begin with the staples that sustained the vast majority of the population. Rice was the foundation of the diet in the eastern regions of the empire, including the Gangetic heartland, where Pataliputra stood. The Mauryan period saw the cultivation of multiple varieties of rice, each suited to different growing conditions and culinary purposes. The Artha Shastra mentions Vrihi and Sali as common varieties, along with Kodrava and Priyamgu, and notes that two new varieties, Draka and Varaka, were introduced during this period. Rice was typically boiled and eaten with accompaniments of lentils, vegetables, and for those who could afford it, meat or fish. In the western and northwestern regions of the empire, wheat and barley predominated. These grains were ground into flour and made into flatbreads, the ancestors of the chapati and roti that remain staples of Indian cuisine today. Between the main crop seasons, a third harvest produced pulses, the lentils and beans that provided essential protein in a diet that was, for many people, largely vegetarian. The dal that remains central to Indian cuisine today, lentils cooked with spices and served as a sauce for rice or bread, was already taking shape in Mauryan kitchens. Dairy products formed another crucial component of the Mauryan diet. Cow's milk was most common, but the milk of buffaloes, sheep, and goats was also used. Fresh milk was consumed, but more often it was transformed into longer-lasting products. Yogurt, which could be eaten plain or mixed with rice and spices. Butter, which was clarified into ghee for cooking and religious rituals. And various forms of cheese and curd. Ghee, in particular, held a special place in Mauryan culture, serving not only as a cooking fat, but also as an offering to the gods, a fuel for sacred lamps, and a medicine in the Ayurvedic tradition. Meat was consumed by many Mauryans, though the period saw the beginning of the shift toward vegetarianism that would later characterize much of Indian society. The Arthashastra describes the duties of the superintendent of slaughterhouses, indicating that the consumption of meat was regulated but not prohibited. Fish, poultry, and goat meat were common among non-vegetarians, while wild game was hunted by the aristocracy and consumed at royal feasts. The influence of Buddhism and Jainism, with their emphasis on ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings, was beginning to make vegetarianism a mark of spiritual refinement, though it had not yet become the dominant dietary pattern. The flavors of Mauryan cooking were shaped by the spices that India produced in abundance and traded across the known world. Black pepper, the king of spices, grew on the western coasts and was already being exported to the Mediterranean, where it commanded prices that made it worth its weight in silver. Cardamom and cinnamon, ginger and turmeric, cumin and coriander. These aromatics transformed simple ingredients into complex dishes that delighted the palate and, according to Ayurvedic theory, promoted health and balance in the body. Sweets held a special place in Mauryan cuisine, as they would throughout Indian history. Honey was the primary sweetener, gathered from wild hives or produced by domesticated bees. But sugarcane was also cultivated, and the Mauryan period saw the development of various sugar products. The juice of the cane, pressed fresh and drunk immediately. Gouda, a form of raw sugar or jaggery, and refined sugar produced through processes that were already sophisticated. These sweeteners were used in the preparation of desserts that might include milk, rice, fruits, and nuts. The ancestors of the kheer and halwa that remain beloved in India today. Fruits provided both nutrition and pleasure. Mangoes, which the Greeks would later call the king of fruits, were cultivated in orchards and prized for their sweetness and fragrance. Bananas, pomegranates, and jackfruit were common, along with citrus fruits, grapes, and the many varieties of melons that thrived in the Indian climate. Dried fruits, dates, raisins, and figs were imported from the West and consumed as luxuries by those who could afford them. Bindusara's request for dried figs from Antiochus suggests that even the imperial kitchens found certain Mediterranean delicacies difficult to obtain. Beverages accompanied meals and punctuated the day. Water was the most common drink, but it was often flavored with herbs or fruit juices to make it more palatable. Buttermilk, the liquid remaining after butter was churned from yogurt, was a refreshing drink, particularly valued in the hot months. For those occasions that called for something stronger, various forms of alcohol were available. The Arthashastra describes the duties of the superintendent of liquor, indicating that the production and sale of alcoholic beverages was regulated by the state. Wines were made from grapes, dates, and other fruits, while rice beer was brewed from fermented rice. The manner of eating was as important as the food itself. Meals were typically served on banana leaves or clay plates, with the various dishes arranged in a specific order that reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. People ate with their hands, using the fingers of the right hand to mix rice with accompaniments and convey the food to the mouth, a practice that continues in India today and that was considered more refined than the use of utensils. The markets of Pataliputra would have offered a sensory feast to any visitor. Spices from the south filled the air with their pungent aromas, while bolts of cotton cloth in every shade from undyed white to deep indigo were stacked in the shops of textile merchants. Metalworkers hammered copper and bronze into vessels and ornaments, their rhythmic clanging providing a constant percussion beneath the calls of vendors and the haggling of customers. Goldsmiths displayed their wares, necklaces and armlets, earrings and finger rings, their surfaces catching the light that filtered through awnings of woven palm fronds. And everywhere, the punch-marked silver coins of the Mauryan treasury changed hands, their irregular shapes bearing the symbols of imperial authority: the peacock, the hill with crescent, the sun, and the six-armed wheel. For the common people, of course, such luxuries were beyond reach. The farmer's wife might own a single piece of jewellery, perhaps a simple nose ring or a pair of glass bangles, that she wore on festival days and special occasions. Her everyday clothing would be of coarse cotton, perhaps homespun and home-woven, dyed with whatever colours could be extracted from locally available plants. Yet even these humble garments followed the same basic patterns as those of the wealthy, the same principles of draping and wrapping that had evolved over centuries of Indian civilization. This continuity across social classes gave Mauryan material culture a certain coherence, a shared visual language that united the emperor in his palace and the peasant in his village. Chapter 5: The Prince of Roughskin, Taxila, Succession, and the Rise of Ashoka. In the northwestern reaches of the Mauryan Empire, where the ancient city of Taxila commanded the crossroads of trade routes linking India to Central Asia and beyond, the seeds of a succession crisis were being sown that would ultimately determine the future of the dynasty. Taxila, known in Sanskrit as Takshashila, was one of the most strategically important cities in the empire, a centre of learning renowned throughout the ancient world, and a gateway to the territories that Chandragupta had won from the Seleucids. It was also, during Bindusara's reign, a source of persistent unrest that would test the abilities of his sons and reveal the fault lines within the imperial family. The citizens of Taxila revolted twice during Bindusara's reign, according to multiple sources. The reason for the first revolt, as recorded in the empire's chronicles, was the maladministration of Susima, Bindusara's eldest son, who had been appointed as viceroy of the northwestern province. Susima, the crown prince and designated heir to the throne, apparently governed with a heavy hand that alienated the local population. The Ashoka Vedana, a Buddhist text meaning the narrative of Ashoka, provides a dramatic account of what followed. Bindusara dispatched his son Ashoka to address the situation, but, in a detail that speaks volumes about the tensions within the royal family, the emperor refused to provide any weapons or chariots for Ashoka's expedition. The legend states that the devatas, or deities, then miraculously brought soldiers and weapons to Ashoka, enabling him to march on Taxila. When his army reached the city, the residents approached him with a remarkable message. They told him that their rebellion was only against Bindusara's oppressive ministers. They had no problem with the emperor or the prince. Ashoka then entered the city without opposition, and the devatas declared that he would rule the entire earth one day. This story, while clearly embellished with supernatural elements, may preserve a historical kernel, that Ashoka successfully resolved the Taxila crisis through a combination of military presence and diplomatic skill, winning the loyalty of the local population in a way that his elder brother had failed to do. The historicity of this legend receives some support from an Aramaic language inscription discovered at Sirkap near Taxila. The inscription includes a name that begins with the letters Prida, which most scholars restore as Priyadashi, the title that Ashoka would later use in his famous edicts. Another piece of evidence is the name of the Dharmarajika stupa near Taxila, which suggests that it was built by Ashoka. These archaeological traces indicate that Ashoka did indeed have a significant connection to the city, lending credibility to the literary accounts of his role in resolving the unrest. The Dharmarajika stupa itself deserves a moment of contemplation. Rising from the dusty plains near Taxila, this great hemispherical monument of brick and stone would become one of the most sacred Buddhist sites in the subcontinent. Pilgrims would travel for months to circumambulate its base, their footsteps wearing grooves into the paving stones over centuries. The stupa's name, Dharmarajika, meaning of the righteous king, speaks to Ashoka's later transformation and his embrace of Buddhist teachings. But in the days when Ashoka first came to Taxila as a young prince, that transformation lay far in the future, hidden behind years of ambition, conflict, and the hard education of power. The story about the deities miraculously bringing weapons to Ashoka may be the text's way of deifying the future emperor, or it may indicate something more revealing, that Bindusara, who disliked Ashoka, deliberately sent him to Taxila without adequate resources, perhaps doubting his abilities or hoping he would struggle. If this interpretation is correct, the Taxila episode reveals the depth of the tensions between father and son. Tensions rooted in Ashoka's birth to a mother of lower status and his physical appearance, which the texts describe as rough-skinned and unappealing to his father. The prose version of Ashoka names 3 sons of Bindusara: Susima, Ashoka, and Vigatashoka. The mother of Ashoka and Vigatashoka was a woman named Subhadrangi, the daughter of a Brahmin from the city of Champa, near the Mauryan capital, Pataliputra. According to the legend, when Subhadrangi was born, an astrologer named Pingalavatsa predicted that one of her sons would be an emperor and the other a religious man. When she grew up, her father took her to Bindusara's palace in Pataliputra, where she was inducted into the imperial household. The Ashoka provides a poignant account of Subhadrangi's early life at court. Bindusara's other wives, jealous of her beauty, did not allow her to approach the emperor and instead trained her as the imperial barber, a position that, while humble, required great skill and brought her into intimate proximity with the sovereign. She became expert at her craft, and whenever she groomed the emperor's hair and beard, he would become relaxed and fall asleep. The tensions of ruling a vast empire momentarily dissolved. Pleased with her skills, Bindusara promised to grant her one wish, and she asked the emperor to take her as his wife. Bindusara was initially hesitant about her humble position at court, but made her the chief empress after learning about her Brahmin descent. The couple had 2 sons, Ashoka and Vigatashoka. Despite Subhadrangi's eventual elevation to chief empress, the circumstances of her entry into the palace, as a servant trained by jealous co-wives, may have cast a shadow over her son's status. The texts state that Bindusara did not like Ashoka because his limbs were hard to the touch, a physical characteristic that apparently offended the emperor's aesthetic sensibilities. This personal dislike, combined with the lower status of Ashoka's mother compared to Susima's mother, meant that Ashoka was never considered a serious candidate for the succession during his father's lifetime. The Mahavansa, the Great Chronicle, a Sri Lankan Buddhist historical text, states that Bindusara appointed Ashoka as the viceroy of Avantirastra, the province centered on the important city of Ujjain in central India. This appointment may have been a form of honorable distance, placing a capable but disfavored son away from the capital, while giving him a position of responsibility that would keep him occupied. Ujjain was an important administrative and commercial center, and governing it would have provided Ashoka with valuable experience in statecraft. Ujjain itself was a city of considerable antiquity and importance. Situated on the banks of the Shipra River, it lay at the intersection of major trade routes connecting the ports of the western coast to the Gangetic heartland. The city's markets bustled with merchants trading in textiles, spices, precious stones, and the fine cotton muslins for which the region was famous. Its temples drew pilgrims from across the subcontinent, and its astronomical traditions were so renowned that Indian astronomers would later designate Ujjain as the prime meridian for calculating celestial positions, the Indian equivalent of Greenwich. It was in this vibrant city, according to Sri Lankan tradition, that Ashoka met and married Devi, a woman from the nearby town of Vidisha. Devi would become the mother of his children, Mahinda and Sangamita, the missionaries who would later carry Buddhism across the sea to Sri Lanka, establishing a tradition that continues to this day. The marriage to Devi appears to have been a love match rather than a political alliance. The texts describe her as a merchant's daughter, not a princess, and she apparently did not accompany Ashoka when he later moved to Pataliputra. Yet her children would play a pivotal role in spreading the Dharma far beyond the boundaries of the Mauryan Empire. Shortly before Bindusara's death, there was a second revolt in Taxila. This time, Susima was sent to address the unrest, but he was unable to resolve the situation. The reasons for this second revolt are unknown, but Bindusara could not restore order in his lifetime. It was eventually Ashoka who brought stability to the region after his father's death. The contrast between Ashoka's earlier success in Taxila and Susima's difficulties would have been noted by those at court who were already calculating the implications of the coming succession. When Bindusara fell seriously ill, the question of succession could no longer be avoided. The Ashoka Vedana suggests that some ministers favoured Ashoka's claim to the throne, noting that he had been predicted to become a Chakravartin, a universal ruler whose chariot wheels would roll unimpeded across the earth. However, Bindusara's preference for Susima was clear, and the dying emperor apparently resisted any suggestion that Ashoka should succeed him. The transition of power that followed Bindusara's death around 273 BCE was not smooth. Court factions supported different princes, and the tensions that had been building throughout Bindusara's reign came to the surface. According to later Buddhist texts, Ashoka secured the throne after a period of conflict with his brothers. These texts speak of violence during the succession, though scholars believe the accounts were significantly exaggerated to emphasize Ashoka's later transformation. The contrast between the ruthless prince and the Dharma-following emperor made for a more dramatic narrative of spiritual awakening. The Mahavamsa and Dipavamsa, the Sri Lankan chronicles, describe a contested succession in which Ashoka emerged victorious over his rivals. The 4-year gap between Bindusara's death, around 273 BCE, and Ashoka's formal coronation, around 269 to 268 BCE, suggests a period during which the succession remained uncertain, a time of maneuvering, negotiation, and perhaps conflict, before Ashoka's position was secure enough for the elaborate coronation ceremonies to proceed. Ashoka's own inscriptions, erected long after his coronation, refer to his brothers and sisters and other relatives for whose welfare he expressed concern, suggesting that members of his family continue to serve in the imperial administration and that the succession, however contested, did not result in the complete elimination of rival claimants. The traditions maintain that Ashoka captured the throne with the support of the ministers of the late monarch, headed by the chief minister Radhagupta, indicating that his victory was as much political as military. The succession crisis that followed Bindusara's death was the culmination of tensions that had been building throughout his reign. The favoritism shown to Susima, the marginalization of Ashoka despite his evident abilities, the role of court factions and ministerial calculations, and the unresolved question of Taxila all contributed to a situation that required resolution. When Ashoka finally emerged as the undisputed emperor, he inherited not only the vast territories his grandfather and father had assembled, but also the administrative challenges and regional tensions that came with ruling such a diverse realm. Meanwhile, in the lands far to the northeast, in China, where the Warring States period was entering its final, most intense phase, parallel processes of state formation and imperial consolidation were unfolding. The year 298 BCE, when Bindusara ascended the Mauryan throne, was a pivotal moment in Chinese history as well. King Huiwen of Zhao, who ruled from 298 to 266 BCE, his reign thus overlapping almost exactly with Bindusara's, was consolidating the gains his predecessor had made and positioning Zhao as one of the two great powers of the age, alongside Qin in the west. The state of Zhao occupied the northern reaches of the Chinese cultural sphere, its territories stretching across the Loess plateaus and river valleys of what is now Shanxi and Hebei provinces. The Zhao had distinguished themselves through military innovation, particularly their adoption of cavalry tactics, learned from the nomadic peoples of the northern steppes. King Wuling of Zhao, Huiwen's predecessor, had famously ordered his soldiers to abandon the traditional Chinese robes and chariots in favor of the trousers and mounted archery of the northern nomads. A reform that scandalized conservative opinion, but transformed Zhao into a formidable military power. The scale of mobilization in Warring States China was remarkable. The great states could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, supported by sophisticated systems of conscription, supply, and command. The Mauryan army, which Greek sources estimated at some 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, and 9,000 war elephants, was thus comparable in size to the forces that the great Chinese states could command, a testament to the demographic and economic resources that both regions possessed. The eventual unification of China under Qin in 221 BCE, 52 years after Bindusara's death, would create an empire that in some ways paralleled the Mauryan achievement. Like the Mauryas, the Qin would establish a centralized bureaucratic administration, standardize weights and measures, build an extensive road network, and attempt to impose cultural uniformity across diverse regions. The first emperor of Qin, Qin Shi Huang, would connect existing defensive walls into what would become the Great Wall, just as the Mauryas maintained the royal highway connecting Pataliputra to the northwestern frontier. Yet the Qin dynasty would last only 15 years before giving way to the Han dynasty, which would consolidate and institutionalize many Qin innovations while tempering their harshest aspects. The Mauryan Empire, too, would fragment after Ashoka's death, though its administrative and cultural legacy would endure in the successor states that emerged from its dissolution. Both empires demonstrated that political unification on a subcontinental scale was possible, even if maintaining such unity across generations proved elusive. As Ashoka prepared for his formal coronation around 269 to 268 BCE, he stood at the threshold of a reign that would transform not only the Mauryan Empire, but the religious and cultural landscape of Asia. The rough-skinned prince whom his father had disdained, the capable administrator who had won the loyalty of Taxila's citizens, the ambitious claimant who had emerged victorious from a contested succession, all of these would give way to something unexpected. But that transformation lay in the future, waiting to be catalyzed by the horrors of conquest and the quiet voice of a wandering monk. For now, the new emperor surveyed his inheritance, an empire stretching from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal, from the Himalayas to the Deccan Plateau, held together by roads and armies and the memory of his grandfather's achievements. The question of what he would do with this inheritance, whether he would simply maintain it or attempt to expand it further, would soon be answered in the blood-soaked fields of Kalinga. Chapter 6. The Invisible Emperor. Legacy between two titans. When Ashoka finally secured the Mauryan throne after the tumultuous succession struggle that followed his father's death, he inherited not merely an empire of vast territorial extent, but an administrative apparatus of remarkable sophistication. A system of governance that Bindusara had maintained, refined, and in some respects expanded during his quarter-century reign. This administrative inheritance would prove crucial to Ashoka's ability to implement his revolutionary program of Dharma. For without the infrastructure of provincial governance, the network of officials, and the channels of communication that his father had preserved, the famous edicts would have remained mere words carved in stone, rather than instruments of imperial policy. The Mauryan administrative system, as outlined in the Arthashastra and confirmed by Greek accounts and archaeological evidence, represented one of the most centralized and efficient bureaucratic structures of the ancient world. At its apex sat the emperor, the supreme sovereign, holding executive, legislative, and judicial powers. The king was supported by a council of ministers, the Mantriparishad, composed of high-ranking officials who advised on matters of state. Below this central authority extended a hierarchy of officials, the Mahamantras, or high commissioners, who implemented policy, the Adhyakshas, or superintendents, who oversaw specialized departments, and the vast network of provincial and local administrators who translated imperial directives into daily governments. The empire under Bindusara was divided into provinces, each governed by a Kumara or royal prince, who served as the king's representative. The edicts of Ashoka, which provide our most detailed information about Mauryan provincial administration, give the names of 4 provincial capitals: Tasali in the east, Ujjain in the west, Suvarnagiri in the south, and Taxila in the north. These 4 great cities served as nodes of imperial authority, each the seat of a viceroy who exercised considerable power within his jurisdiction while remaining accountable to the central government at Pataliputra. The provincial administration replicated the structure of the central government, ensuring a uniform system of governance throughout the empire. Each province was divided into districts under the command of a sthanika, while Gopas were responsible for overseeing 5 to 10 villages, ensuring local governance and administration. Villages were semi-autonomous units governed by a Gramani, appointed by the central government, along with a council of village elders who maintained local order and resolved disputes. Urban areas were managed by a Nagarika, responsible for the administration and development of cities within the Mauryan Empire. Bindusara's contribution to this administrative system appears to have been one of consolidation and refinement rather than radical innovation. The basic structures had been established by his father Chandragupta under the guidance of Chanakya, but maintaining such a vast bureaucracy over a quarter-century required constant attention to detail, the appointment of capable officials, and the suppression of corruption and inefficiency. The espionage system, which the Arthashastra describes in remarkable detail, was particularly important for an empire of the Mauryan scale. The text outlines an elaborate network of spies operating under various disguises, as householders who ascertained the fair collection of taxes and the fair accounting of villagers' lands, as merchants who monitored trade and reported on economic conditions, as ascetics who gathered intelligence in temples and religious gatherings, and as courtesans who extracted information from officials and nobles. These agents served 3 primary objectives: reporting on conditions throughout the empire, conducting covert operations when necessary, and ascertaining the loyalty of civil servants at all levels. Bindusara is credited with strengthening this espionage network, expanding its reach to cover the newly conquered territories of the Deccan, and ensuring that the central government remained informed about conditions in even the most distant provinces. The system operated on the principle that knowledge was power, that an emperor who knew the true state of his realm could act decisively before problems escalated into crises. The revenue system that Bindusara inherited and maintained was equally sophisticated. The Arthashastra describes a nationally administered system of taxation that was strict but fair, operating under principles that balanced the need for revenue with the welfare of the population. Peasants were taxed from 1/4 to 1/6 of their produce, with additional charges for irrigation and tolls on commodities at town gates. The revenue collected supported the massive standing army, the extensive bureaucracy, and the public works projects that characterize Mauryan rule. The infrastructure of roads and communications that connected the empire was another crucial element of the administrative inheritance. The Uttarapatha, or Northern Road, linked Pataliputra to Taxila and beyond, facilitating both commerce and the rapid movement of troops and officials. Other routes connected the capital to the ports of the western coast, the agricultural regions of the Gangetic Plain, and the newly conquered territories of the Deccan. These roads, maintained by the state and lined with trees for shade, as Ashoka's edicts would later boast, enabled the circulation of goods, people, and information that held the empire together. When Ashoka began to promulgate his famous edicts, those remarkable inscriptions carved on rocks and pillars throughout the empire, proclaiming his commitment to Dharma and non-violence, he was able to do so because the administrative infrastructure was already in place. The provincial governors who received his directives, the officials who oversaw the carving of inscriptions, the messengers who carried imperial commands to distant regions, and the local administrators who implemented his policies were all products of the system that Bindusara had maintained. The economic networks that connected India to the wider world during Bindusara's time were substantial. The monsoon winds that governed navigation in the Indian Ocean were well understood by sailors of this period. Ships could ride these seasonal winds from the Red Sea and Persian Gulf to the western coast of India, then return on the reverse monsoon, a pattern that made regular maritime commerce possible. The ports of the western Indian coast served as entrepôts where goods from the Mauryan interior met products from the west. Indian exports included the spices that would become legendary in the Mediterranean world, cotton textiles already being produced through sophisticated weaving techniques, and precious stones from the mines of central India. The spice trade, which would become so important in later centuries, was already significant during Bindusara's reign. Black pepper, the king of spices, grew on the Malabar coast of southwestern India and was being exported to the Mediterranean world. The economic prosperity that trade generated helped fund the splendors of Bindusara's court and the administrative apparatus of the Mauryan state. In the grand sweep of Indian history, Bindusara occupies a curious position, sandwiched between two figures of towering significance: his father, Chandragupta Maurya, who founded the empire, and his son Ashoka, who transformed it through his embrace of Buddhist Dharma and his renunciation of aggressive warfare. This placement has led some historians to treat Bindusara as a mere transitional figure, a placeholder between the empire's dramatic founding and its ethical transformation. Yet such a view fundamentally misunderstands both Bindusara's achievements and his historical significance. To appreciate Bindusara's role, we must understand the magnitude of what he inherited and what he passed on. The challenge facing Bindusara when he ascended the throne around 298 BCE was not to create something new, but to maintain and consolidate what his father had built. This task, though less dramatic than conquest, was in many ways more difficult. Empires are easier to create than to sustain. The initial momentum of conquests can carry a state forward, but the long-term work of administration, the management of diverse populations, and the maintenance of loyalty across vast distances require different skills and sustained effort. Bindusara's quarter-century reign represents precisely this kind of sustained consolidation. The extension of Mauryan control over the Deccan, while certainly a military achievement, was also an administrative one. The integration of new territories into the imperial system, the establishment of provincial governance, the extension of the road network, and the incorporation of local elites into the Mauryan hierarchy. These were not the flashy accomplishments that capture historical imagination, but they were essential to the empire's long-term viability. Yet the very fact that the Mauryan Empire survived intact through Bindusara's reign and was passed on to Ashoka in a condition that allowed for the latter's remarkable transformation speaks to Bindusara's success as a ruler. The administrative structures that Ashoka used to promulgate his edicts, the provincial system through which he implemented his dharma policies, the road network along which his pillars were erected, the economic prosperity that funded his building projects, all of these were maintained and strengthened during Bindusara's reign. The cosmopolitan atmosphere of Bindusara's court, with its Greek ambassadors, Ajivika teachers, and diverse philosophical traditions, created an environment in which Ashoka was exposed to multiple worldviews and religious systems. While Ashoka would ultimately embrace Buddhism, his famous tolerance for other religions and his promotion of contact between religions may have been influenced by the religious pluralism of his father's court. In this sense, Bindusara's patronage of the Ajivikas and his openness to Greek philosophy may have inadvertently prepared the ground for Ashoka's later religious policies. The succession crisis that followed Bindusara's death, while traumatic, also demonstrated the resilience of the Mauryan administrative system. Despite what may have been years of civil strife between Bindusara's death around 273 BCE and Ashoka's formal coronation around 269 to 268 BCE, the empire did not fragment. The bureaucracy continued to function, the provinces remained under control, and the military apparatus stayed intact. This institutional resilience was Bindusara's legacy, a state structure robust enough to survive even a contested succession. In the end, perhaps the greatest testament to Bindusara's success is precisely the fact that he has been overshadowed by his son. Ashoka's remarkable reign, his renunciation of warfare after the Kalinga campaign, his promotion of Buddhist Dharma, his edicts proclaiming ethical principles, was only possible because Bindusara had maintained and strengthened the empire he inherited. The platform from which Ashoka launched his ethical revolution was built by his father's 25 years of patient consolidation and administrative refinement. As we consider Bindusara's place in the global history of the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, we should recognize him not as a mere transitional figure, but as a ruler who successfully navigated the difficult challenge of sustaining an empire through a period of consolidation. Like Antiochus I, maintaining the Seleucid Empire, like Ptolemy II, presiding over the golden age of Ptolemaic Egypt, Bindusara was a participant in the great age of empire building that characterized this period. His achievement was not the dramatic conquest of his father or the ethical transformation of his son, but the patient, sustained work of governance that made both possible. The legacy of Bindusara's Deccan conquests would endure long after the Mauryan Empire itself had faded. The administrative structures established during this period provided the framework for subsequent dynasties, most notably the Satavahanas, who would rise to power in the Deccan after the Mauryan collapse. The trade routes opened during the Mauryan period would continue to carry goods and ideas across the plateau for centuries. And the cultural synthesis begun under Mauryan rule, the blending of northern and southern traditions, of Vedic and local religious practices, of imperial and indigenous forms of governance, would shape the distinctive civilization of the Deccan for millennia to come. And so, as the oil lamps flicker low in the palace of Pataliputra, and the great wooden gates of the city stand closed against the night, we leave Bindusara to his rest, this emperor who conquered 16 kingdoms, who exchanged letters with Greek kings, who patronized strange ascetics who believed all things were fated, and who raised a son who would transform the very meaning of empire. The monsoon winds still sweep across the Gangetic plains, carrying the scent of jasmine and sandalwood. The Ganga still flows past the ruins of that ancient capital, bearing its waters toward the distant sea. And the memory of Bindusara, the slayer of enemies, the ruler of the land between two seas, endures, not in monuments of stone, but in the administrative framework that made possible one of history's most remarkable experiments in ethical governance. May your dreams carry you gently through the ages, past empires risen and fallen, past the patient work of countless hands that built the world we have inherited. And may you wake refreshed, knowing that even the forgotten rulers of history played their part in the great tapestry of human civilization. Good night.